Now, programming from the Illinois Channel, an independent, nonpartisan corporation formed to provide nonpartisan coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois. For more information on the Illinois Channel, please visit our website at www.illinoischannel.org.
Just ahead, Senate and House Republicans hold a press conference to unveil their budget plan. Then in about 45 minutes from now, we talk to Roger Eddy, the executive director of the Illinois Association of School Boards, about whether K-12 schools will be able to open in the absence of a state budget. Following that, in about 1 hour, State Treasurer Michael Frerichs holds a press conference calling on the governor to sign the Life Insurance Reform Act. The act would require life insurance companies to search their records and confirm they are not holding death benefits that should have been paid to families of the deceased. And finally, in about 1 hour and 30 minutes, Illinois Channel correspondent Jeff Berkowitz sits down with Ted Dabrowski, the Vice President of Policy for the Illinois Policy Institute, as Mr. Dabrowski explains how the state can pass a balanced budget without raising taxes. That's all just ahead, after a brief word from one of our advisory council members.
The Illinois Channel salutes our advisory council members, leaders in business, education, law, medicine, and other fields from across Illinois.
Hi, I'm Jason Leahy, Executive Director of the Illinois Principals Association. Education has never been more challenging in Illinois than it is right now, with comprehensive education reform recently passed by lawmakers and our state's financing of education remaining under pressure. That's why the Illinois Principals Association acts to represent the needs of students and our members. We keep our principals up to date on changes in the law affecting education policy, and we advocate to keep our schools safe and to maintain a healthy environment conducive to learning. With all the changes happening in every field and with the ongoing financial problems facing Illinois, it's vital we all know about changes affecting our lives. That's why the Illinois Principals Association is proud to be a part of the Illinois Channel's advisory on education. Their coverage, whether that of key lawmakers discussing changes in education, an interview with the Illinois Budget Director on the state's finances, or the one-on-one interviews with those working in education, all help to keep citizens across the state connected to the real issues that impact the education of our children. I'm Jason Leahy, Executive Director of the Illinois Principals Association. I'm also proud to say I serve on the Illinois Channel's Advisory Council. The Illinois Channel, it works for all of us.
Next, from Springfield, Senate and House Republicans hold a press conference to unveil their budget plan. This runs about 45 minutes.
Good morning. My name is Jim Durkin. I'm the House Republican leader. In 18 days, we will close a fiscal year and start a new one. Where is the sense of urgency from Speaker Madigan to bring this budget impasse to closure? For the first time in all my years serving in the legislature, Speaker Madigan and his majority did not call a vote on a budget at the end of May. Why? These are questions we need to know. I am stating right now that we must act now to pass a negotiated, comprehensive, balanced budget with reforms to change the status quo and how we operate in Illinois and to boost our struggling economy. The time for subject matter hearings like the one that is going to start a little bit later this morning with the sole political purpose of assigning blame is over. It must come to an end. The men and women the Democrats will trot out today are being fooled. They are nothing more than human shields for the Illinois House Democrats' economic failures this past decade. Lawmakers from both parties should be in Springfield working together to get the job done once and for all. Joining me are a few of my Republican colleagues from the House and the Senate to put forth a clear path of action to end the impasse. I also want to make note that Leader Radonio is not here today because she is already on a planned family vacation. She would be here otherwise. We recognize and appreciate the hard work that has been done in the Senate by both Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans. We are essentially picking up where they left off before Senate Democrats chose to go it alone. The bills we are filing today include provisions many Democrats have said in the past that they are willing to accept, taken as a whole, and that we believe would be signed by the governor. Our comprehensive proposal includes a novel concept for Illinois Democrats. It's called a balanced budget, hard spending caps, lasting property relief, property tax relief, and changes to our regulatory system that will create jobs. It also includes term limits on legislative leaders and the constitutional officers. The package also includes pension reform and a school funding bill that takes the best from Senator Barrickman and Senator Menard's proposals. We are calling upon our Democrat colleagues in the House and Senate to join us in passing a balanced budget with reforms, not a new concept, guys, that are good for taxpayers and will put Illinois back on track to the state that we love, the state that we grew up in. We must go back to Springfield and finish our job. As I've stated all year long, if you respect our legislative priorities, we will respect yours, and we will find a common ground. However, the Speaker's members should no longer put up with Speaker Madigan's my way or the highway approach towards governing, which has lasted for decades, and it hasn't worked. I am now going to turn over this microphone to my colleagues, and they will talk more in depth about our proposals. Right now, I'm introducing Senator Dale Ryder.
Good morning. My name is Dale Ryder. I'm a state senator from the 55th District, which is all our parts of 14 counties in east central and southeastern Illinois. I serve as the minority spokesperson on the Appropriations 1 Committee and had the pleasure this past legislative session of spending endless hours with a number of my Republican colleagues and Democrats working to shape the bipartisan compromise that would give us a balanced budget and reforms that has been talked about for a long period of time. Before going into what we are going to do today on the budget, I want to ask that we just spend a few seconds and rewind the tape to last month. We were in the midst of budget meetings with the Democrats, not daily meetings, 2 or 3 times a day meetings, making progress on what they thought they needed to see, what we needed to see in a balanced budget compromise. On May 17th, the Democrats walked out of the room and passed their own budget, their own spending plan. We went back and met with them again. We continued to meet with them for the next 6 days. On May 23rd, the Democrats again chose to go their own direction, even though we had meetings scheduled on budgets, on education, and on property taxes. That very day, we spent that day instead debating the Democrats' tax increase and budget proposal with no reforms, and of course that is the one that passed. Now, our friends on the Democrat side of the aisle have talked to us incessantly, and we agree that in terms of the budget, in order to force Speaker Madigan to show any kind of pulse over in the House of Representatives with regards to a balanced budget, that we needed to send over from the Senate to the House a balanced budget package in a bipartisan nature. The Senate Democrat budget fails both tests. And so we are here again today to try once again with another compromise effort at a spending package that we hope would be bipartisan and is certainly balanced. This is what the package entails. Again, it's a balanced budget. It contains a hard spending cap of $36 billion. It achieves balance by reducing and making adjustments in spending of approximately $5 billion through reforms and reductions in spending, and pays down a portion of the staggeringly high backlog of bills that is growing every single day because of inaction on a balanced budget. Now, there's been much talk about compromise from our Democrat friends. Well, the Republicans just won't compromise. They just won't compromise. I want to give you a few areas where, in fact, where we sat down at the table with them and they said, we need to have this, and we said, okay, not necessarily because all the Republicans thought it was a great idea, but because we're trying to reach a compromise. One, pension parity, agreeing that the state will pick up the Chicago Public Schools' normal cost of their pensions. Two, we had originally proposed through the budget that Senator Bill Brady had introduced in May to reduce transit spending statewide, primarily downstate. The Democrats said, well, we don't want to see that deep of a cut. So we agreed to halve the cut. In other words, add back more spending. Three, the Democrats came to us at some point and said, there are a number of programs throughout agencies that you've suggested that we reduce. We need $130 million of those back. We agreed to that and gave back $130 million. The Democrats said, we'd like to see you means test some of the exemptions that taxpayers get right now. We agreed to that. So in this filing, in this budget, we have agreed to means testing for the standard deduction, for the credits you get for property taxes, and for the education expense tax credit. The effort here in this balanced budget filing is to pick up where the negotiations were broken off by the Democrats on May 23rd. We agree with our Democrat friends. The best way to prompt Speaker Madigan into action is to pass to the House a balanced budget that has Republican and Democrats votes supporting it. That's what this effort's about. With more information, I want to pass it on to my good friend and colleague, State Representative Patty Belloc.
Thank you very much, Dale. I'm Patty Belloc, and I'm the Deputy Minority Leader and the Minority Chair of the Human Service Group and also the Human Service Approach. So today we're looking at a comprehensive balanced budget that Dale just reflected on, and we're offering a full year funding for human services. I hope that this will move us forward from the partisan impasse that we have had to a bipartisan compromise today. It's not a lifeline or a stopgap measure. It's a comprehensive, balanced budget that will provide funding for our state's most vulnerable citizens. Our budget fulfills the commitment to restore the child care eligibility to 185% of the federal poverty level. It provides $35 million towards the direct support professional once a balanced budget passes. It funds Teen Reach, youth employment programs, and addiction prevention programs that we all want to see in place, especially with the heroin problems we're encompassing today. Our plan provides grant funding and regular funding for individuals with developmental disabilities, including the Autism Program of Illinois, Best Buddies, and the epilepsy programs, also the Immigrant Integration Services. With last week's court ruling, which was extremely important, on the $2 billion backlog of unpaid Medicaid bills, it's critically important that we take immediate action to address this backlog, as the judge had said in the federal court. Our plan includes a revenue bond issuance to help pay off those old bills. That's approximately $4.3 billion, not including Medicaid match. The budget bills passed by the Democrats did not include any money to help pay down the bill backlogs, whereas we, in this compromise, hope to move forward on that to help the most vulnerable citizens. It also increases the assessments levied on the hospitals from $340 million gross to $170 million net. It puts them in a better position than 3 years ago. This budget impasse cannot go on any longer. Too many of the most vulnerable citizens that we deal with every day have been put in harm's way. The consequences of not taking any action now would be absolutely devastating to all the human service providers and to the people, the most vulnerable people that we help throughout the year. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to introduce Senator Barackman. Thank you.
Thanks, Patty. My name is Jason Barackman. I am a senator from the 53rd District out of Bloomington and represent much of East and Central Illinois. I have had the pleasure of serving on the Education Committee for a number of years now. I was a member of the Governor's Education Funding Commission chaired by Secretary Purvis, and I think we're all aware of the significant discussions that have occurred over, quite frankly, many years on our school funding formula. We all believe that it's time to fix the broken school funding formula. It's important that any change to that school funding formula result in a fair and equitable system that's fair to all the students of this state, all the districts of this state, whether the students live in Chicago, suburbs, or elsewhere. The formula needs to be a statewide formula that's fair for each of those school districts, each of those students, and tries to treat each of those the same. I think there was significant progress that resulted from the Governor's Reform Commission. There were a number of areas where you saw bipartisan and bicameral agreement among the legislators. We know that in the spring we engaged in very significant negotiations. I was a part of those negotiations in the Senate, where we tried to pick up where the commission left off. We filed multiple bills. Senator Menard had his, I had mine. We had hearings on those legislation. And with today's amendments that we're filing, I think you will see widespread total agreement on a number of things related to the formula. There's agreement on the fact that we need to use an evidence-based formula that utilizes 27 elements based on best practices. We're in total agreement on how we handle poverty concentration, the tier structures, regionalization factors and adjustments to the formula, protections and safeguards for our English learners and special ed funding, how we calculate available local resources, what's in the base funding minimum. On all these areas, you'll see in today's legislation that we're in agreement. And I think we're in agreement as a result of those negotiations that occurred over the spring session. Senator Ryder talked about the fact that in late May, Democrats veered off course. They decided that they wanted to walk away from those negotiations and move forward legislation on their own. That's, in fact, what they've done. That legislation has placed us where we're at, with a lack of a bipartisan agreement. But with the bills that we're filing today on education funding, again, you'll see total agreement from both sides on all those issues just that I've outlined. That doesn't mean there's not a few areas where we need to close the gap. And that's what we try to do here today with our bills. In fact, our bills pick up from where those negotiations left off and advance ideas that are an attempt to split the difference or pull from the respective Democrat and Republican priorities that were represented in those negotiations, put it in bill form, and show where Republicans are willing to take votes. This includes the elimination of the Chicago, where we close the gap is both sides have agreed that we should eliminate the Chicago block grant, but we are proposing today that instead of not rolling some of those funds into the base, that we in fact will roll in funds for funding for children, personal reimbursement, and summer school, an attempt by Republicans to recognize the priorities expressed in those negotiations. We also tried to split the difference on how we handle a hold harmless. The Democrat proposal contemplates an indefinite hold harmless that does not go away. That is not reflective of the negotiations. So we put forward a hold harmless that rolls off over a series of years, again in the spirit of those negotiations. We propose mandate relief. Mandate relief has always been a part of the discussions, but we've removed some of the most hostile provisions of the mandate relief, leaving intact those pieces where we think there can be bipartisan agreement. And finally, we remove the notion that the state of Illinois is going to pick up CPS's legacy pension costs, but in doing so, and as alluded to by Senator Ryder, we agree to pick up the CPS normal cost for their pensions. So my hope is that we will, in the final days of this month and the end of the fiscal year, that we will see meaningful action on this legislation that I think is now queued up and ready for bipartisan support in Springfield. With that, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Senator McConaughey.
Good morning, Senator Karen McConaughey, representing the far western suburbs. I, like Senator Ryder and Senator Berkman in the Senate, were working on the negotiations that abruptly came to an end when the Senate Democrats decided to walk away from the table in and around the 23rd of the month, and I was working on the area of reform. And so, which is really important for the conversation that we're having about a balanced budget and the need to talk about increasing taxes, because Illinois is the single largest exporter of people, businesses, and the jobs that those businesses create. And we cannot, when there's this mad exodus out of our state, we cannot fix a fiscal crisis by simply increasing taxes on an ever-shrinking pool of taxpayers. Instead, we need to create a pathway and a direction that puts us back in an a vitally economic position that encourages businesses to come back to Illinois and to stay in Illinois, and ultimately creates jobs. So we need to acknowledge what the factors are that push businesses out of the state, that cause people to leave our state, and it's time that we address it, and it's time that we address it now. One of those is work comp, and that was one of the key issues that was involved in the negotiations that fell apart on the 23rd, and yet I will tell you, we have the 8th highest work comp costs of any state in the entire country, and we were negotiating with the Democrats at a point where we were down to the one last piece was a contextual sentence regarding traveling employee. For reasons unknown, the Democrats walked away from that and instead passed a work comp bill that was so watered down that I'm not sure why they bothered with the effort. And the idea that has been suggested on work comp that we have been unwilling to compromise, the critical issue that was on the table at the time was the medical fee schedule, which is the one area, while there was many other minor changes, that was the one area that we could offer to the business community as a true savings. Because be very clear that while the average taxpayer in Illinois may not understand what the implications of work comp are, I assure you the business owners do. And they pay attention to how that impacts their bottom line. And when you are the 8th highest, if you can reduce the cost through the medical fee schedule, it is a way to encourage businesses to stay in Illinois and increase jobs. We were very willing to compromise. There were a number of things that Republicans found that were very important to us. That included causation. Democrats didn't want to talk about that. Indemnity benefits and AMA guidelines, all things that mean something to the business community and that have been expressed as incredibly important. And in an effort to try to compromise with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, we agreed to put that aside for the moment to try to reach compromise. I was at the table, many of us were at the table, and we look forward in a bill being introduced in the House, hopefully an opportunity for the Democrats to come back to the table and work on that as well. The other area is property tax reform. The governor's talked about it. Many of us, I represent the far western suburbs, we talk about this all the time, and our taxpayers talk about this all the time. We have, if not the highest, I understand we're now in competition with the state of New Jersey for the highest property taxes in the United States. Either way, we are taxing people right out of their homes. People are paying more in property tax than they are making their mortgage payment. The same applies to our businesses. So while they're looking at key indicators as to whether or not Illinois is a friendly place to do business, where they want to be here to create jobs, they are looking at work comp, but they're also looking at the property tax implication and the overall business regulation that plagues Illinois in a way that creates that exodus of businesses. So in the proposal that we have talked about, we originally wanted a permanent freeze to property tax as a way to change this conversation in a state that has more units of local government than any other in the country. And as I said, taxing people out of the home, we needed to stop the bleeding and go for a permanent tax. That was rejected by the Democrats. We worked together and agreed that we would support a 4-year temporary income tax along with a 4-year property tax freeze. That way we give people some relief with the income tax by freezing their property tax, and at the same time it forces a change in the conversation about how we govern at the local level and how do we change our strategy to reduce the cost of property taxes. We also, as a part of that, in the compromise, agreed to exempt the debt levy. We saw that as something that was important to the Democrats. We agreed to that. And last but not least, we also agreed to the idea that we need to empower people at the local level. We need to give taxpayers the ability to go to referendum and make decisions at that level about what size government do they want and how much do they want to spend on it. That proposal that we have put on the table includes the ability for taxpayers to every 4 years by referendum lowering the threshold, by referendum choosing to lower, raise, or keep their tax levy the same. We think that that is the very minimum starting point to providing relief to our taxpayers in Illinois, and that is something also that fell apart at the last moment on the 23rd. And again, this will be in proposals going to the House, and we look forward to hopefully our colleagues on the other side of the aisle joining us to continue that conversation. So I will turn it over to Representative Tom Demmer.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Tom Demmer. I'm a representative from the 90th District. What you're hearing today is a series of compromises from House and Senate Republicans, both around the budget and around meaningful reforms that will improve the state. Over the last couple of years, I was a member of the Local Government Consolidation Task Force, and we looked at the increasing burden that local government costs have placed on taxpayers across the state. As Senator McConaughey mentioned, we have more units of local government than any state in the country by a long shot. That redundancy and those levels of bureaucracy add up to bring Illinois to some of the highest property taxes in the country. Our proposal for local government consolidation strengthens the already passed Senate Bill 3 and empowers citizens to initiate consolidation measures. The Citizens Empowerment Act gives the public the ability to put referendum on the ballot and have voters weigh in on whether consolidation is the right choice for their community. We're also offering pension reform, which many people would acknowledge is an important step in putting Illinois back on a sustainable path and addressing one of the largest challenges that the General Assembly has struggled with over the last several years. Our proposal in pension reform accepts Senate Bill 16, which has previously passed the Senate and includes President Cullerton's consideration model and, as was mentioned, the state's pickup of the Chicago Public Schools' normal pension costs. The plan also creates a Tier 3 hybrid approach for newly hired members and gives local governments a choice when they're adding new employees. Both pension reform and local government consolidation offer tools to lower the overall cost of government to help bring down the burden that we place on taxpayers across the state. What we've heard today is a series of compromises in the budget and in reforms. We stand together today to say that we have the time, we have the willingness, and now today we have the legislative proposals, and that House and Senate Republicans stand ready to solve this problem and to end this impasse. Thank you, and we'll take questions.
Leader Durkin.
Yes.
Two questions. One, have you vetted this with the governor? If you had any kind of commitment from him that if this were to pass as proposed, he would sign it?
Yes. That's correct.
So can we call this his proposal?
This is the Republican proposal, House and Senate and Governor's proposal. Absolutely.
House, Senate, and governor's proposal. Second, how much does this provide for Chicago Public Schools as opposed to SB 1?
Anybody know that?
With the filing of the legislation today, we will ask the State Board of Education to provide us runs so that we can provide those numbers to you, hopefully very shortly.
Well, in general terms, is it more? Is it less?
More than SB 1?
More? Is it less than SB 1?
It is more than they received last year.
Okay, but is it much?
I can't tell you specifics until I get the run, but it will be more than they received last year.
Jim, why would Madigan go for this?
Well, I guess the question is whether or not the Speaker is committed to breaking the impasse, because he needs my votes. His members are frustrated. I talked to them. There's pressure building up in the House Democrat caucus to get this to resolution. He has 67 votes. He needs at least four Republican votes, starting now, to do anything, to pass anything. So if he's committed to breaking the impasse, he needs to work with us and work with me. But if he does not talk to us nor work with us on it, to me, it is just a reflection on his desire to do nothing and to make sure the governor is the one who will be hurt next year in the gubernatorial campaign.
You say that he needs your votes, and yet here as you're weighing out the compromise on property tax relief, it says a 4-year freeze rather than a permanent freeze. As a compromise for making the Democrat pass income tax increase sunset. So are you planning to put votes on an income tax increase?
I've said for the past 2 years, and so has the governor stated, that if there are meaningful structural reforms and that there's cuts in state spending and state government, we would entertain and support revenue. And I stand by that today. It has to be the right balance, though.
You're referring to it as a Democrat pass income tax increase in your compromise outline.
I'm not familiar with that document, but the fact is, getting to the ultimate question, yes, we are prepared to do that, to work with the Democrats, to put votes on revenue on the condition that they work and actually work and pass what we've laid out today.
Jim, I don't want to elaborate on that. The language that you're referring to, that's the Senate. Only Democrats voted for, I believe, Senate Bill 9 in the Senate. So that refers to the passage out of the Senate. And as I think you've alluded to, we'd like to see 2 changes to that. One is the income tax increase. The Democrats want to make it permanent. We think it should be 4 years to match the property tax relief duration that we have put on the table, and the Democrats have previously agreed to. The second change would be the Democrats want to make their tax increase retroactive all the way back to January 1st. We think that's completely unfair to taxpayers. We want to see it start when the fiscal year starts, and that would be July 1.
And then in front, you talked about spending caps, right? $36 billion. If we're willing to vote on the income tax increase, are there cuts involved in this, and what's getting cut?
Yeah, there's cuts.
There are. I mean, first of all, there are reductions. But you're saving money through pension reform. You're saving money through group health insurance. You're saving money through procurement, so that's less money we have to spend. And there is also throughout this budget across-the-board cuts, all state agencies, all 3 branches of government, in the neighborhood of 5% or a little bit less. That's how you get the rest of the savings. We recognize we're going to have to ask state government across the board to just tighten the belt.
Will these be amendments or new bills, rather?
There'll be amendments that'll be filed. Well, I was waiting for the Speaker to call us back, but right now we're in the 2nd week of June, and we absolutely no communication from him of when we're going to go back into session. And we are going to be running out of authority after July 1st. That is why, which has prompted us to do this today, to say that this is what we can accept. Even more important is, as we said earlier, he needs our votes if he truly wants to get a budget passed. He can't just do it on his own. So this will be amended today.
So amendments or new bills?
I believe there are amendments. Amendments, new bills? It's going to be a combination. The House is going to be introducing the reforms. The Senate is going to be introducing the budget-related bills.
When you say he can't just do it on his own, actually can, but then the governor could veto it. So are you saying that this is what the governor would
You need 71 votes to pass anything out of the spending plan. You need 71 votes in the House. The governor, and 60 is no longer the threshold. He has 67 members. He needs a minimum 4 Republicans to be able to support him on any initiative that is going to go into effect immediately.
Okay, but are you saying that this is what the governor would need in order to be willing to?
There has to be substantial compliance with what exactly we've laid out today. Absolutely.
Can you give us an idea, Jim, of how much in this that you hand out today was in some form of the Democratic plans that moved to the Senate that had very little Republican support?
I'm going to have to let the Senate talk about that because they're the ones who... Sure.
Yeah, to be clear, and any one of us, the 3 of us, could answer this from our individual perspective. But what happened, again, remind you, we got up to May 23rd. We were in negotiations. We're very close on all of these issues that we've been talking about today. For reasons that you'd have to ask the Senate Democrats, they left the bargaining table and went and passed their own bills that did not reflect what we had been agreeing to in negotiations. So of course there were not going to be any Republican votes because it didn't reflect what we had been negotiating in good faith.
So how much of this, what percentage of what you're proposing now was part of the Democratic plan?
What the House is going to be considering is very reflective of where we were in good faith in our negotiations with Senate Democrats. That is where the House is picking up the conversation. We think that's the good faith position to be in. We thought we were very close. We thought we were passing legislation out of the Senate that was going to be bipartisan. And for reasons that we never could quite understand, the Democrats walked away from that. We'd like to come back to that.
But the question Kristen is asking is, how much of that plan that we had agreed to remains in this plan?
Yeah, so let's take it as an example, the education proposal. And to pick up, though, on the question, sure, but think of this to your question. The Democrats had three choices in the Senate, right? They could have introduced legislation that reflected an agreement with Republicans. They clearly did not do that. Alternatively, they could have introduced legislation that they suggested reflected the negotiations, but were, even though there wasn't an agreement, was as far as they would be willing to go. They clearly did not do that. Instead, they did choice three, which is their own proposal, their own starting points. And so we have picked up from where those negotiations were. We kept saying they were very close. We have picked up from there, and now are introducing legislation designed to close the gap on those remaining items.
With no tax hike, I mean, there's a huge difference between the two proposals. We wouldn't put any votes on a tax hike, so why would you have expected a different outcome than the Democrats on May 23rd saying we're leaving here when you kept standing up and objecting?
Well, I want to first, I guess I'm going to challenge a little bit the premise of your question about we weren't going to put any votes on a tax increase. As has been said at this podium, as has been said at dozens of podiums for, 2.5 years now, Republicans are willing to agree to new revenue in exchange for some other things for taxpayers. If you're going to dig deeper into taxpayers' pockets, I think it's reasonable to expect that they be given a little more control over their government or a little more economic opportunity. So with all due respect, that's never been said by the Republican leadership. In terms of the budget, your question about, there's nothing in the budget that will be filed today that either wasn't in the previous filing by Senator Brady or has been talked about at the table. There's nothing new in here. But there's a critical difference here, and I want to highlight this because this is an example of part of the reason of why we're in the position we're in today. What Republicans talked about at the table for the entire month of May and what was in Senator Brady's budget filing was a savings of $435 million for changes to the state employees group and health insurance program. The governor has proposed, in Republican support, changing the benefit structure to save cost for taxpayers to the tune of $435 million. The Democrat-passed budget incorporates the $435 million in savings, so they count it, but makes no changes to the actual program, which is a little like saying, my utility bill is $200 a month. I want to save on my utility bill, so I'm going to write the utility company a check for $150. You didn't save anything. You just put the extra $50 over for the next year. So the Senate Democrat budget adds to the backlog of bills by saying we're going to save on group health insurance, but we're not actually going to change the program. That is a critical distinction here. That can be the difference between a balanced budget and not a balanced budget.
Senator, a follow-up question on the education piece of this, whichever one of you wants to do it. How do you run a school district if at any point in time a majority of voters, most of whom may not have their kids in the school, can decide to cut taxes as much as they want? How can you run a government? How can you run a business? How can you run anything without stability?
I'm not sure where you're going there.
Referendum, people can cut the property tax?
The formula is designed to reflect the fact that every school district has varying levels of available local resources. As those change, the formula will react to it. It's an example of fixing the inequities that exist today.
But doesn't your proposal say that by referendum, voters in a school district could vote to cut their property tax?
Yes, we have.
How do you get stability? How do you run a district? The financial base can be undercut at any point by whoever decides to show up at the ballot box.
This is simply about local empowerment. This is about allowing taxpayers who currently are being taxed out of the very communities that they live in, whether they're first-time buyers or they're retirees, they can't afford to stay in the communities that they are in. We have enough faith in local taxpayers that, given the opportunity to engage their local level school boards in a discussion about the cost of education, because we spend different amounts to educate our kids in different communities, but to allow people at the local level to make a determination about how much they want to spend on education is what we're talking about here, is to change that conversation that allows taxpayers to have that discussion with their local school boards, because right now there isn't anything in place that creates that opportunity.
If you're local taxpayers, then why not submit all of your state tax stuff to a referendum repeal option 2?
Oh, well, we can talk about that.
I'm for that.
Sure.
I'm for that. You bet. Yes.
You mentioned that, the issue here is whether or not the speaker wants to end this impasse.
Yes.
If, for whatever reason, there is no meeting of the minds before July 1st, or, for that matter, into the end of the year, who do you believe the voters will blame for? Do you believe they will blame Mike Madigan? Do you believe they will blame the governor?
I'll speak for myself. For the past 2 years, the Republicans have been working with the Democrats on reforms year after year. These are what the governor campaigned on when he ran for office and what he's promised Illinois voters. He's also said that if we are going to ask more of Illinoisans every April, they need to see a return off the investment, which they haven't received in many, many decades. So the governor has made it very clear that what he needs to be able to perfect a balanced budget that is responsible, that reflects the values of people in the state of Illinois. It requires more work than just passing a budget with a state tax increase. It's just not going to happen. The governor has been consistent on that, but every time that we try to work with the Democrats in good faith, look at these working groups over the past 2 years. They lead us down a path and then they pull the rug out from underneath us in May. We are trying, the governor is trying to bring resolution to the problem we have in the state of Illinois. Our business community is struggling. We are asking for reforms in the business community. I'm not sure how many opportunities down the road we'll have we'll have the ability to have these actually completed. So this is the time to do it. We will work with the Democrats, but the fact is, if we walk out at the end of the month, I'll speak for myself, it's because of the Democrat leadership in the House of Representatives who do not want to work with Republicans to break the impasse.
And it will be the governor who decides how much reform is enough.
You're looking at it right now.
Do any of you up there believe that it is possible to balance the budget and get the state's financial situation in order without a tax increase?
I think it'd be very difficult. I'm going to be perfectly frank with you.
So, don't you all also want a tax increase?
I don't want a tax increase, but the fact is we got to pay our bills. We have to be responsible and we have to be honest with Illinoisans. And that's why I'm saying if we're going to ask more of them every April, we sure as heck better do a better job of returning the investment to them based on reforms and also the things which we've laid out, which is a property tax increase. I wish we didn't have to pass a tax increase, but the fact is when you're sitting on $12 billion of unpaid bills, you have budgets that have gone awry based on the Democrats' budgeting over the last 3 years, $7 billion out of balance, $4 billion out of balance. That's what creates this backlog of bills. So the fact is we can't be deadbeats. We have to be responsible. We're going to have to take tough measures. But as I said earlier, I'm prepared to put votes on revenue in exchange for the Democrats working with us to complete what we have on these boards.
But that's you're holding that out as like that's the Democrats want the tax increase and you're willing to give them the tax increase, but now you're saying you also want the tax.
Look, I'm not going to do it the way in which they want it, like they did 5 years ago or 6 years ago, which is basically a tax increase with absolutely no strings attached that did nothing to solve the problems in the state of Illinois. Most of that money went to pay the pension systems, but the fact is it's a matter of last resorts, but I am prepared to take that up and work with the Speaker on new revenue on the condition that he is going to substantially comply with what we are going to be filing today with respect to budget and also reforms.
So is this an all or nothing deal, like if Democrats want to throw out term limits and government consolidation?
We'll have to make that decision as this time comes, but I will just say this, based on my discussions with the governor, that I use the word substantial compliance. We are not going to go in and say that we're going to have reform light or anything that is significantly diluted, and that will be based on how if they counter us on any of these measures. We'll have to make a decision at that point. But again, I'm just going to state that the Democrats need to substantially comply and support what we are proposing today, and we will work with them to fix and get this impasse over with once and for all.
Just one last thing. Can I? Well, one last thing on that. I apologize. Is you asked a question about, is this the bottom line? These filings are compromises. I mean, let's put this in context. The budget that Bill Brady introduced in early May was a compromise based on what we had been hearing from the Democrats. This budget filing is a compromise. The other filings with regards to property tax and with regards to workers' compensation and those issues are already compromises. We're putting on paper what the Democrat majority said they needed in the meeting. So we are already there. They just need to come across the table and meet us halfway. Thank you.
Next, from Springfield, we talked to Roger Eddy, the executive director of the Illinois Association of School Boards, about whether K-12 schools will be able to open in the absence of a state budget. This runs about 15 minutes.
Roger Eddy, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel. Before we get started in the interview, let me just say for the viewers that you're also a member of the Illinois Channel Board. But we wanted to talk to you as we tape this on June the 9th. We still don't have a state budget. The schools are going to be opening in somewhere along the line of, 6 to 7 weeks or something like that. What's happening inside school boards and school districts across the state of Illinois at this moment where you don't know if you're going to be even having the money to open schools?
Well, I think school districts across Illinois are analyzing where they are. June 30th, of course, is the end of the fiscal year for most school districts in the state, and they're going to determine how they ended the year, what their expenses are for next year, what their cash flow is, and for some, because they rely on money from the state, they're going to try to calculate without state money, when it is that they might have to consider not opening their doors. So we sent out, the Management Alliance, through the Superintendent's Association, and the business officials sent out a toolkit just a few days ago to school officials so that they can begin to have those conversations, analyze their current position, and communicate to their public, which I think is tremendously important, the position they're in, and eventually, in a transparent manner, show them exactly how much they have and how long it might be until they reach a crisis.
So we're obviously going to have differences in funding levels around the state. And so some schools will have a lot of money in the bank, others may have virtually none. Do you imagine that, what would you foresee a school district doing? Would they say, if we can't stay open for 6 months, we're not going to open at all? Or do you think that they would basically open their doors and operate as long as they can?
Well, 6 months is a long time. I think when you have revenue or you have resources available, no matter where it comes from, based on the cash flow, some of it's going to be property taxes that come due and be dispersed at a certain time, that you're going to stay open because you have the revenue to stay open. Will there come a point when some of these districts do not have revenue to stay open? Absolutely. Some may have already used tax revenue they're anticipating this fall for tax anticipation warrants to make it through the spring. So that's not really cash, that's money that's going to pay off existing debt. They're going to be in a different situation than a school district that was able to make it through this year and has property tax revenue coming in, and they might be able to last several months based on property tax revenue. And when the part of the year comes when they've always relied on state aid to take over, and they've exhausted their local resources, they're going to have to close. So the key is analyzing that and then communicating that to the public so that your taxpayers and your local parents understand exactly the situation that you're in and what might be forthcoming should there not be a budget. And, to do it in an open, honest, and transparent way, your number one, really your number one mission, your number one responsibility is to serve the educational interests and resources that you have to meet those for children in your district, and you need to do that as long as you can.
What are there with the teachers who are the labor side of education, let's say, are there legal requirements that if you have to close a school because you're just not going to have the money, is there some lead time by which you have to say to the teachers, hey, we're going to have to close come, 3 months from now or 2 months from now?
Well, I think you certainly have to make known to everyone in the community, and the teachers are an important part of both the school community and the larger community. So, yeah, I think you're going to have to make sure everyone understands your position based on the revenue you have and other local considerations, whether or not in some cases, for example, school districts are willing to borrow money to go a little bit longer. That will all be determined locally. Some may have reached their debt capacity. There are legal limits to how much they can borrow, and they may have reached that. Yeah, they need to let teachers know, they need to let parents know, they need to let community members know, and just as importantly, they need to have that conversation with their elected officials and let them know exactly where they stand and the effect that it's going to have. And not only if they can't open, but there's also the effect that diminished funding has on what you're able to provide, even if you can stay open. Is it a quality program? What have you had to cut? What have you had to do in order to keep those doors open that have, diminished the education quality that you're offering children?
The Illinois Channel just aired a press conference that the superintendents held. Now, some people may go, well, wait a minute, how are the schools bad? Because that's the one part of the state budget that the governor and the legislature have funded, the per pupil spending. But there's an area called categoricals that isn't being funded, and the superintendents were saying the state collectively owes us $1.1 billion. But if you break it down to an individual school district, and you came from as a state representative, a rural area, the cost of busing alone can be very expensive, right? And so what impact, where are the schools? I guess the question would be this. As you talk to other school boards and school districts around the state, is there any consensus that they say, if you're not going to give us a full budget, that they're obviously, how much of a pressure, I'm trying to form the question, but how much pressure is there to form a full budget as compared to saying, okay, we'll at least take the same thing we got last year where you're funding per pupil?
Well, first of all, the superintendents that came did a terrific job. I think they made the case to their local representatives in the General Assembly as a whole. I watched the press conference, and they were spot on. Mandated categoricals for FY17 haven't been paid, over $1 billion. So they said, we need payment for those categoricals. That was money that we budgeted in some cases to keep our doors open. So that point was well made. The point about needing a budget for K-12 was well made, but the broader point is a budget that funds social services also helps school districts. So school districts rely on an array of social services that are available to communities that may not be being funded, even though the school is being funded. So I think the broader message is we need a full budget so that all of those services that communities use and work together to support children can be funded in a way that really helps the education of kids outside of the school budget. So, but I think their message was good, and I think they had their priorities straight and really delivered in a strong way. So we're really happy and proud of the work they did that day.
For the viewers' sake, so you represented a rural area in the legislature, so you know, and you worked as a superintendent yourself, right? So you are very familiar with education. It's your career. But as a state legislator, you also saw, and this job, you know what's going on around the state, upstate, downstate, etc. Andy Menard, and was a backer for making the case for school funding reform. What are your thoughts on that? Not just to make it about Andy Menard, but just in general. To what extent do we need school funding reform, and is there any direction that you think the state ought to be going?
Well, I think Senator Menard, to his credit, made this, shine the spotlight on what I think people have known for a long time, and that is Illinois has a terribly inequitable funding system, and one that needs to be corrected. There have been several attempts to do that. Senator Berrichman kind of became very involved in the same way to try and shine a spotlight on it, but not only talk about what's wrong, but here's how we can fix it. And of course, the Alliance management, including school board associations, superintendents, principals, and business officials, along with some other partners, through our Vision 2020 kind of resource program for what we thought the future of education should be like, champion an evidence-based funding model. And we believe very strongly that that is a much better model to provide real transparency as to what the adequacy target for each school district in the state should be based on their student population, their unique demographics. And we also believe that the distribution model that was in that formula, as it was supported by the Alliance, really distributed new dollars in a manner that would drive those dollars to the districts that were the farthest away from the adequacy target. Things happen along the way to what you believe to be the right way to do things, and politics sometimes gets involved in that. But the formula itself and the 27 elements and the tier distribution, I think, is as solid as ever and has a tremendous amount of support, and we certainly support it.
I might ask a question, when does it become critical as far as opening the schools? And as I asked that, it's probably critical right now. But is there a point in time where you say, look, if we don't have the funds, if you guys don't pass even some partial funding for education, we're just not going to be able to open? Where's that line of demarcations that the viewers should be looking to say, here's the drop dead date? That otherwise, you really just either don't open the schools or you're going to have to push the opening day back to Labor Day.
Well, I think those calculations have to take place now. I think the fact is that today we don't have a budget that will fund K-12 education. So if you're doing the responsible thing at the local level, you're making those calculations. And it's going to be different. Every school district is going to have that different date that you're talking about. But those calculations should be done now. And you have a reasonable idea of how much revenue you are going to be taking in based on property taxes. You know when state aid payments normally would take place and when you need them to fit into cash flow to open your doors for a certain period of time. So I think those calculations and those communications, as I said earlier, need to be done now. Time is of the essence to make sure that you communicate with both your public, your teachers, as you mentioned, and also members of the General Assembly. So hopefully those calculations will be done quickly in June by school boards led by their superintendents and business officials, and parents will be informed, and they'll know if it's August 15th, if it's September 15th, whatever those days are that they're facing that pressure that you described, they'll be able to communicate that to their local constituencies.
Let me ask one last question, we'll close out. There was some rumor that the governor would call a special session. That's almost wouldn't surprise anybody, I don't think. But I'm curious, are you in communication with the administration? I mean, given your position here as head of the school boards, or do you hear from Beth Purvis or anyone else? Are they reaching out to you and asking for relative to education funding for your input?
Well, we've had in the past communications with Dr. Purvis, and certainly we communicate with the administration along with the four leaders. And recently we did send a communication to them that really kind of told them what they already knew, and that's how critical it is for schools to have a budget to operate with and to plan. So as necessary, and as we get these stories and as school districts let us know, we certainly pass that information along so they understand the critical nature. But I think they have a pretty good idea. I heard Dr. Smith, Tony Smith, the other day in a stakeholders meeting talk about the fact that the State Board of Education, monitors this stuff as well, and the funding issues that are facing certain districts. They're, I'm sure, getting calls directly from those school districts. But yeah, we communicate as we need to. We also understand that the administration and Dr. Purvis working on an array of issues, and this is one part of a huge kind of public policy questions that they're trying to determine. But we're going to advocate for schools and for a budget for schools. We would love to see a full budget. That really is what should happen, because a full budget does really in a broader way, support what we're trying to do in education.
Roger Eddy, we appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us.
Appreciate it.
Next, from Springfield, State Treasurer Michael Frerichs holds a press conference calling on the governor to sign the Life Insurance Reform Act. The act would require life insurance companies to search their records and confirm they are not holding death benefits that should have been paid to families of the deceased. This runs about 30 minutes.
House Bill 302 is the Life Insurance Reform Act, and it attempts to right a wrong that has been going on for decades. It requires life insurance companies to keep their promise and pay death benefits. Nothing more, nothing less. And I think that's just the right thing to do. Now, not all life insurance companies pay death benefits after one of their policyholders passes away. Some life insurance companies acknowledge that unpaid death benefits have been used to increase their profit margins. Now, that, to me, is unacceptable. I've never met a man or a woman who purchased a life insurance policy because they wanted to make some insurance company more profitable, or because they wanted to make sure that an insurance executive got a bonus. Life insurance benefits are designed to ease the financial pain during a family's darkest hour. And these monies keep a house from being foreclosed upon, or keep a child from having to drop out of college. The Life Insurance Reform Act is a very simple piece of legislation. It requires life insurance companies in Illinois to review their records back to the year 2000 to make sure that all death benefits have been paid to policyholders who have died. Now, why is this needed? Because I said, not all life insurance companies pay in a timely manner. And how do we know? In Illinois, life insurance policies are considered unclaimed property, and that falls under the Treasurer's office. Between 2011 and 2015, we identified more than $500 million in unpaid life insurance benefits. About $550 million that was not paid out to grieving family members. And we know that there is more. We know this because the dollars that we identified represent life insurance companies that work collaboratively with Illinois State Treasurer's Office. They open up their books and let us come in to audit their records. But sadly, not all life insurance companies are such good corporate citizens. One company, Kemper, has decided to sue my office to block these audits. And that's why we must stand together to protect the consumers of this state. And I'm joined today by a lot of those champions who are helping us in that fight. So it is also clear the insurance lobby worked against the legislation, needlessly tried to make it partisan, and is urging Governor Rauner to veto this legislation. And how do we know this? The vote totals in the House and the Senate were mostly along party lines. As you can see, though, I'm joined here today by Senator McCann. There are some people who stood up, regardless of party, and did the right thing. Now, the last time I checked, death knocks on all doors. A party line vote defies logic, especially when you consider Republicans in other states led the charge on this issue. Republican-led legislatures in Florida and West Virginia also passed similar, and in some cases tougher, legislation. So I want to commend Senator McCann for breaking ranks and doing the right thing. The legislation last year was prospective. It was going forward. We passed similar legislation last year. This will require life insurance companies to go back to the year 2000, identify people who had policies in effect, and notify their beneficiaries. And they do this by using the Social Security Death Master File. It is a database put together by the Social Security Administration to prevent against waste and fraud. And it's something that has been used by life insurance companies who sell annuities. So we know this is something they can do. So last year, there was also opposition. We traveled around the state. We had task force hearings, and people up here behind me today joined in those. And we created pressure, and the governor signed last year's bill. That's what we hope to do this year. So we simply want them to use companies' Death Master File to look backward to the year 2000. I think it's a simple and a reasonable request. However, this issue that touches every one of us has been muddied up. A common sense solution is now soiled with alternative facts, and that's why I'm here today, to ask upon your help to call upon Governor Rauner to sign House Bill 302 into law. And I want to give you an opportunity to hear from some of those champions. We've got this far. We've passed legislation through the House and the Senate because of the work of senators and representatives and partners we've enlisted in this fight. And you'll also get a chance to hear from a couple people who have benefited by previous work we've done in this office to identify beneficiaries and notify them and get them what their loved ones wanted them to have. Because at the end of the day, people buy life insurance policies because there's someone in their life that they care about. And whether the policy is for $1 million or $3,000, it meant something to the person buying that policy. And we want to make sure the life insurance companies keep the promises that they made to their policyholders. So first up today, we'll hear from Senator Andy Minar, a great champion, a great fighter of consumers in the Illinois State Senate. Senator Minar.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Treasurer Frerichs. I will be brief because my belief is that this legislation is as common sense as it can come in Springfield. I want to first compliment the State Treasurer for his continued work, for being a consumer advocate, and for pushing these issues forward in front of the General Assembly. The governor ought to sign this bill. This is a common sense reform measure that is consumer friendly, that affords individuals the opportunity to benefit from something that they paid for. There's $6 million that's owed to families in the state of Illinois that is being held. And in many times, these families are unaware that that benefit was paid for, most oftentimes by a spouse or another family member. This bill is a common sense way to approach this issue. I've talked to many constituents in my Senate district that have benefited from Treasurer Frerichs' work over the past several years in regards to unclaimed life insurance policies. And many times these changes in their life based on a set of principles and things that family members paid for are life-changing to the survivors. I think that's an important notation behind this legislation. The governor ought to put his signature on this bill so that people who paid for life insurance finally receive the benefits that they're entitled to. The Treasurer's Office has made this a fundamental issue in recent years. And again, I compliment Treasurer Frerichs for continuing to push forward bipartisan legislation that, again, would make available life insurance benefits to individuals who have paid for it.
Thank you, Senator. I really appreciate your help in being such a good champion for consumers in this state and fighting on their behalf. Every person in the state Senate, every senator gets one vote. But I want to make a special point to Senator Sam McCann, who's going to join us and speak here today. Senator McCann was an early supporter, and I know he faced a lot of opposition amongst his caucus, but I think he's demonstrated over the course of his career the ability to break with the party when he thought that it was for the right, it was good for his district. And that's another example. And I want to thank you for his support, not just voting for this bill, but being a co-sponsor of the bill, Senator Sam McCann.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. Appreciate it. Mr. Treasurer and everyone else, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I want to compliment the Treasurer and his staff. You do a fantastic job. You do a tremendous job with your unclaimed property division, the unclaimed life insurance, and all of the other work that you do as our state treasurer. You and your staff are phenomenal. Again, this is common sense. I know that word's been used a lot today. It's the one term that comes to my mind most commonly when we think about this concept or this idea. I remember the first time that I heard about this being an issue around the country was, I believe it was a 60 Minutes report. When I saw this air, I thought, wow, this is something we need to work on. And then as I started investigating it, I saw that, again, as the treasurer alluded, Republicans around the country were leading the charge on this in many places. So it is common sense, and it's about doing what's right for the people. Unfortunately, around here, we've got caught up in this partisanship. We've got caught up in the political will instead of governing. And we need to get out of campaign mode, go into leadership mode at all levels, and do what's right for the people. Remember that we take an oath, that it's not about, campaigning does no good. It does no good to get elected if you can't come here and convey the will of the people, and develop good public policy that helps the people of not only our districts, but the state as a whole, and hopefully moves the country forward. Unfortunately, we live in a time where we're putting partisanship ahead of citizenship, and we've got to get back to being Americans and Illinoisans first. And I thank the treasurer and his staff and everyone up here who helped make this a reality. It's going to help people. It's good public policy. It's the right thing to do. And I urge the governor to sign the bill. Thank you.
You know, I just said that every senator's got one vote. Senator Benar, Senator McCann both lent their votes to get this bill passed. But Representative Sue Scher, she voted for it twice. The bill started in the House, it went to the Senate where it was amended, had to go back to the House for concurrence. So she was a champion twice on behalf of this issue. And last year when we were fighting, she came forward and shared personal stories as well. And so I would like to hear from Representative Sue Scher.
Thank you, Treasurer. I appreciate all of your work on this tirelessly for many years. I care about the people of our district. It's not fair. It's not right what's going on. It's a very reasonable request to ask insurance companies to check their death records. It's just that simple. In an audit that was performed, it showed that 65% of the policies that were not paid out to the beneficiaries were lapse policies, meaning that the people were simply dead. No wonder they couldn't pay their policy. I remember when I was a kid, my mom, who's now nearly 96, living in a nursing home, she can't see the E on the chart. Her vision's that bad. And somehow she's expected to keep track of this little book that she had 50 years ago that was written in pencil. There's no names on it from the insurance company, just initials. It's so totally unreasonable to expect our citizens to comply, even though you better not miss a payment, because if you do, you're never going to get the money that you put in. The desecration of justice that's going on right now, the desperation in people's lives, the disconnect of the governor with the everyday people, it's simply more than a person can bear. Again, because I care about the people of my district, I implore the governor, please sign this bill and do the right thing. Thanks again to the bipartisan work of my fellow legislators.
Thank you, Representative. A lot of this stuff wouldn't have been possible without the help of senators and representatives. We would not be here today if we couldn't get this bill passed to those chambers. But we also had other allies in this fight, allies who joined us all last summer and fall as we had task force hearings around the state, hearing stories from people who didn't receive the benefits that they were promised. And joining us today, someone whose organization was at every one of those hearings and was a big champion in passing this was the NAACP. And today we'll be joined by Teresa Haley and hear her comments as well. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you, Treasurer. You are the people's treasurer, and this is the people's money. And that's what we want life insurance companies to realize. So many people throughout the state have lost these benefits, are not aware that these benefits exist. As Representative Scher said, I grew up as a poor kid in the projects, and I can remember the milkman and the insurance man coming around, and my great aunts and grandmas filling out that little booklet and giving them their money. We didn't know what that booklet was about because in our cultures, a lot of us, we don't talk about death benefits. We just expect that things will be handled properly and in order upon someone's death. So this is a very good bill, and I ask that the governor support this bill and sign off on it. It has done a great deal for the people of Illinois. I've heard so many testimonies from people around the state that says that I never knew that my grandmother or my aunt or my uncle left money behind. Now our family members, our children, our grandchildren can go to college because that was money that they invested in these insurance companies and believed that they would pay out. So again, I want to thank the treasurer for being the people's treasurer, and I just want to let the life insurance companies know that that's the people's money and you need to do what's right by the people. Thank you.
Teresa, thank you very much. Also, in addition to the NAACP, AARP joined us for all those task force hearings, and we're joined today by Andre Jordan. Andre, would you like to say a few words?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. First, we'd like to commend you for bringing forth and passing House Bill 302. I'm Andre Jordan, as you mentioned, the Associate State Director for Advocacy and Outreach for AARP Illinois. And as it was touched on earlier about caregivers, a sort of a forgotten group. In fact, more than 2 million Illinoisans are unpaid caregivers for their loved ones, whether it's an aging parent, an ill spouse, or a child or sibling with disabilities. They work long hours without respite, and they need support. And among their many self-effacing duties, many caregivers purchase life insurance policies as a means to ensure their loved ones can continue to be cared for should they face the tragic loss of their caregiver. So caregivers as a group, as a whole, throughout the nation, especially here in Illinois, understand how financially costly caregiving is and can be, and they count on the life insurance policy to be there in the unfortunate event their family needs it. Anyone who purchases a life insurance policy for their loved one does so not for themselves, but for the people whom they care. So we strongly urge Governor Rauner to sign House Bill 302 to support Illinois caregivers in their most trying and distressful time. Thank you.
Andre, thank you very much. Now, there's a reason why we do this. We don't do it just to pass a bill. We do it because it benefits consumers out there. Now, a lot of these people who took out these policies, by extension, are no longer with us. But there's someone in their life they cared about, they wanted to provide for, and we're joined today by a couple people that we have, through our audits, been able to track down and reunite with money that was promised to them. In some cases, many years after the death of their parent or loved one. So joining us today, first off, Joe Gant from Decatur, Illinois. I'd like to share his story with money that your mother had set aside for you, or wanted for you.
Thank you. Good morning. Last fall, I received a call from a friend of mine. She said I might have some money coming from the treasurer's office, the unclaimed property. She'd seen my name on their list on their website. It was money from an insurance policy with Prudential on my mother, who passed away 25 years ago. This policy was probably written in the late 60s or early 70s. At first, I thought the insurance company couldn't find me. Then I thought, oh, I'm pretty easy to find. But I realized that the insurance company didn't want to find me. There was no law to force them to make a good faith effort to find beneficiaries. They didn't make any effort. They kept my money for 25 years. That's why we're here today. I want to urge the governor to sign Bill 302 into law to help people get what's rightfully theirs. It shouldn't be political. Yes, it's true, the Democrats introduced it, but Democrats and Republicans got together and passed the bill. If you sign it, maybe that could be the start of something where they might come together on other pressing issues that this state really needs to address. I want to thank the treasurer and his hard-working staff, especially Paris Irvin, for guiding me through this process, which is really a pretty easy process. I urge everybody to go online and see if you might have money waiting for you too. Thank you.
Phil, spell your last name.
G-A-N-T.
Joe, thank you very much for sharing. Joe Grant. 25 years after his mother passed away, we got that money for him. I don't think anyone anticipates their loved one waiting more than 2 decades. At the time of death, that's when people most need that money. Going forward, this legislation will take the treasurer out of this process. Going forward, when people die, they'll be notified in a more timely manner. We want to make sure that those people in the past who owed money, though, get what belongs to them. We're also joined today by Cecil Hill, another beneficiary of a life insurance policy. Cecil?
The policies that I had, I was aware of them, but because of the way they were dated and everything, some of them back in the 30s, early 40s, those were very rough times, and my folks, both of them, worked hard And I know it was difficult to make those payments and run the household, raise me, of course. And thanks to the Treasurer's Office, I had no idea these policies were still good. And like I say, thanks for the Treasurer's Office, what they did and the way they helped me. And let me tell you, the money I got, it was $8,000. It was highly appreciated, and my wife and I put it to good use. So I'll be forever grateful to the Treasurer's Office for the help that they give me. And I hope we can help a lot of other people. This bill is great. We've needed it for a long time. Thank you.
Cecil, thank you very much for sharing. He makes a great point that sometime along the way we said, well, a lot of these policies are for small dollars. They're not a big deal. For his parents who had suffered the Depression, who were putting aside money, it was a big deal. No one buys a life insurance policy for an insignificant amount of money. For them, personally, it was significant. And all this legislation will do at the end of the day is make sure that life insurance companies keep the promises that they made to their policyholders. No one has signed on that line. No one has purchased a policy thinking, I hope my loved one gets their money someday. They were made a promise, and we'd like them to keep it. So I want to thank you all for joining us here today to talk about an issue I think is very important, and I think I speak for people behind me when I say we'd all be happy to answer any questions members of the media might have.
Treasurer, have you called the governor's office, and what reaction, if any, have you had, indicating whether he will or will not?
The bill is under review. So last year, I think he took to the very last day of 60 days before signing it. Didn't give us any indication in advance. Last year, we brought a lot of attention to this issue before he signed it. We're doing the same thing this year.
Treasurer, are some of these insurance companies holding on to these death benefits? Are they building that into their business plan?
Their SEC filings state exactly that. That they count these as part of their business model and as a profit engine for them. You know, to make it clear, my office called one person. I called him personally myself. That he was orphaned at age 15 and was not aware his mother had a life insurance policy when she died. Went to go live with family members who hadn't saved anything for college for him, so he went into the military. A great career. But when we called him last year, he was 28 years old, we'd asked him if he had any idea that his mother had a life insurance policy, and he said, no, I didn't. How much was it for? We said it was for $175,000. His response was, wow, I might have made different decisions in my life if I had that money at the time of her death. Now, a smart guy. He said, wow, that was 13 years ago that my mother passed away. How much is it worth today? He said $175,000. His response, you mean to tell me the life insurance company didn't invest my money? Well, in fact, they did. They invested that money. I'm sure they doubled, more than tripled that amount. And they got to keep it all. And that's why they fought us so hard on this. You know, and I'll tell you, that individual made it clear that he wanted to see legislation like this passed. He didn't want something like that to happen to someone else. That's what's at stake.
I was going to ask, is there any requirement that the insurance companies pay interest on these policies?
No, so there's no requirement they going forward, but with last year's legislation, which required them to check the death master file against their list of policyholders twice a year, the beneficiaries will be paid in a timely manner and interest won't be an issue going forward. Any other questions?
I've got one on a different subject. Were you in the legislature when the tax breaks were given to Sears to stay in Hoffman Estates? And I guess they're trying to now maybe cut those tax breaks off because their employment levels have fallen. Were you in the legislature at the time, and what are your thoughts today about Sears and those tax breaks?
Yeah. Well, I think I was in the legislature at the time, and I think what you saw was they were expected to have certain employment levels. I think they now dipped below it, and so they are losing those breaks going forward, is my understanding.
Do you think they should lose those breaks, and should we be doing other bailouts like that in the future?
I think if there was an agreement, if there was a deal negotiated, that on the one hand, we're going to offer you some incentives to stay here in Illinois, but you have to meet certain requirements, and they don't meet them, if they've not upheld their end of the bargain, I don't think the state should honor its end. I don't know if anyone else here was here who had a kind of comment on that.
Should the state legislature do this in the future, provide these tax breaks to keep companies here?
Well, I think if the legislature is going to do it, I think they need to have clawback mechanisms in case the company doesn't uphold their end of the bargain.
Mike, on the insurance policy, do you, just anticipating what an insurance company possibly would respond, does it matter if the policy is a whole life or a term life?
Well, Senator McCann referred to a 60-minute story, so it shouldn't matter. But we found in some cases, people had whole life policies with value built up. When they died, they stopped making payments. The insurance company, in many cases, documented cases, rather than contacting to see what had gone wrong, why they didn't make their payment, had something happened to them, said, oh, well, we'll just deduct the premium payment from the value built into the policy. And year after year, we continue to deduct the payment on someone who already died. They're paying for a policy after they died. Would draw down the full value that had been built up in a whole life policy. That is unconscionable. They ought to be ashamed themselves for doing that. Under this law, the law passed last year, and this one, they will not be able to do that because they will have to go back and confirm and then notify the beneficiaries. But in other states, yes, I imagine they're still doing that in other states.
Another bill on the governor's desk deals with the Secure Choice Savings Program.
Mm-hmm.
I know that you kind of helped spur that along when you were in the legislature. What's the fate of that program, even if the governor was to sign it? Because the federal rule changes. Is it pretty much dead in the water as of now?
No, not dead in the water at all. Illinois is moving forward. I think the CRA that was passed by Congress and signed by President Trump is going to make it more difficult for businesses in this state. I think ultimately it'll be clear in the courts that the state is the fiduciary. The Secure Choice Board will be in charge of this program and not individual businesses. Businesses that aren't making any choices on plans, they're just facilitating collection of dollars. I think that should be clear. But I also think if the Department of Labor rule had stayed in place, it would be crystal clear from the start that these businesses didn't have any legal responsibility under ERISA. And I think what the members of Congress did, what Congress and the President, was muddy the waters and make it less certain and put additional legal risk on Illinois businesses.
Can you also speak to the possible junk status the state's looking at if nothing's done by the end of the month? But also we had 7 public universities downgraded as well, 5 of them now considered junk status. What's that mean for the taxpayer, and how's your office interact with all that?
Well, we could talk about that for a while. And I would leave it to anyone else here who wanted to comment on this. I'll step away from the mic. But I will first say this is wrong. We are one step above junk status. I don't purchase Illinois bonds. The state doesn't buy its own bonds. But if I wanted to, I would be prohibited. The General Assembly limits where I can make investments. We want to make sure that we preserve capital and that I'm not taking risks in my office in investments. And by their definition, the state of Illinois is too great of a risk for the state to invest in. Now, what does that mean? That means that when the governor goes out and issues more debt, as he's done fairly routinely, we're going to pay significantly more in interest. And some people will say, oh, okay, what does that matter? You know, professors at U of I conducted a study of last year's debt issuance, June of last year, when we had a higher credit rating. It said it cost the state of Illinois an additional $70 million to issue that $550 million in debt. Additional $70 million that could have gone into fixing our roads and our bridges, but gone into our schools or institutions of higher education, and instead is going to Wall Street bondholders. And it's fairly clear that the rating agencies have said the big problem here is the lack of a state budget. We've gone nearly 2 years now without a real state budget in place, and I think that should be the #1 priority for everyone involved in this. Does anyone else want to handle that question?
Well, can you speak to another aspect of the downgrade as well, the debt, the amount of debt we have? Pension debts through the roof, the unpaid bills are topping $14 billion. So, I mean, how does the state get control of that?
I think one place to start is passing balanced budgets and then having a plan to pay down that debt. There's no magic bullet out there, and I Once again, I'll defer to anyone else who's serving in the legislature. There's no magic bullet. If you find yourself your house underwater, the way you get out. If you find yourself with too much credit card debt, is you tighten your belt and you make the payments. And you don't solve your problem overnight, but you start paying it down month after month after month until it becomes manageable. That's what the state of Illinois needs to do as well.
Senator Bernard, just real quick. At the microphone.
Would you like to ask the question first?
Yeah. I know in the past, like with ADM moving out of Decatur or moving some jobs out of Decatur, you had some thoughts on edge tax credits.
Yep.
Should any type of tax credits be used, in this case, in the case of Sears or ADM or anybody else, should tax credits be used to keep these companies here in Illinois?
So sure. I would echo what the treasurer said. If there's going to be a scenario that utilizes tax credits, certainly during a time of a fiscal crisis, there should be the highest bars set. In the case of Sears, there was a job retention number that was agreed upon many years ago. Anything moving forward should have very clear clawback provisions so that if those standards aren't met by the company that accepts credits, then they would have to pay back what taxpayers gave up for them. It's a tricky balance. We went through it with ADM. The treasurer helped me out with that. He helped me navigate through that very difficult water. Ultimately, those weren't granted, as you know, Doug. But each of these things is individual circumstances that are differing than the other. I think it's a mistake to put them all under one umbrella. But I think one thing that is absolutely necessary is that if the business, if the corporation doesn't uphold its end of the bargain that was agreed to, then they owe money back to the taxpayers of the state.
All right. Thank you all very much. Thanks for being here.
Hi, I'm Jim McNamee, President of the Illinois Public Pension Fund Association. Since 1985, we've worked to educate the public and those who serve as trustees and pension boards about issues that impact the financial health of publicly funded pensions. Our members manage over $18 billion in pension assets. That's a huge number. But we never forget those dollars belong to the men and women who've worked as firefighters, police officers, and as educators. We want them to know that their pension dollars are safely invested. They also want to know that someone will keep an eye on legislation that could threaten their pension. And that's why the Illinois Public Pension Fund Association is fighting against laws that would reduce the pensions earned by our members. And this is why we support the work of the Illinois Channel. Their unbiased, in-depth coverage of the pension reform issue allows us and our members to hear arguments on both sides of the pension issue, to follow legislation as it moves through committee, or to hear unedited interviews with key lawmakers as they discuss what changes are being considered. Pensions are very important. They're also very complex. Pension reform can't adequately be covered in sound bites. But the Illinois Channel provides a connection to the Capitol, the governor, and lawmakers that we all need to stay on top of key issues. Hi, I'm Jim McNamee, President of the Illinois Public Pension Fund Association. I watch the Illinois Channel, and I hope you do too.
Next, from Chicago, Illinois Channel correspondent Jeff Berkowitz sits down with Ted Dabrowski, the Vice President of Policy for the Illinois Policy Institute, as Mr. Dabrowski explains how the state can pass a balanced budget without raising taxes. This runs about 25 minutes.
Ted Dabrowski, should there be a tax increase of $5.4 billion?
There should not be a tax increase of $5.4 billion or $7 billion or $8 billion.
Nothing. Zero. You want a zero tax increase? Is that right? In terms of the state, zero increase in the income tax, in the sales tax, nada, nothing.
No, so I think what we need to do is understand that there's been a narrative that there's only one way to fix Illinois, and that's through billions in tax hikes. But most Illinoisans know that the difficulty has been that there's been no reforms done in decades, and that this government, and over the last few decades, has been overspending, overpromising, and has made a mess of Illinois. So what we don't need to do is bail out the politicians again through tax hikes. What they need to do is pass all the big reforms that we've been talking about for a long time, for decades now.
And until we do that, who's been talking about
we the collective of people that want to see a state that's better run and that takes care of its people and its taxpayers first.
So the broad parameters are, the Illinois state budget is how much in terms of spending? Currently, and what's fiscal year 2018 that we're approaching?
It's running some kind of rate of $40 billion, and we don't even know. You know why? Because
there's not been a budget for 2 years.
There's not been a budget, so it's on autopilot.
So the courts and other entities sort of set it, not the state legislature has some impact, but we think 39 to 40 billion are being spent each year for the last few years around it. And the revenue coming in is about how much?
It's about 32 to 33.
So we're
running about a $6 to $7 billion deficit.
Possibly an $8 billion deficit.
But again, that's only because we're running on court orders and consent decrees, not because, right, it's because our legislature did not pass a budget.
Okay, so you think you have a document called, what's the document
Budget
called?
Solutions 2018.
And people can find that where?
On the IllinoisPolicy.org.
Okay, and that will lay out a program by which you have a balanced budget for fiscal year 2018. That means you will have revenue coming in of about 32 billion, spending of about 32 billion, and it'll be a balanced budget. Is that right?
That's right.
People would say, can you really cut $8 billion from what we're spending now and have people have the kind of society, the kind of state they want?
Well, I think we have to remember that the last time we had a budget, a full budget, back in the 2014 under the old tax rates, we spent $36 billion. So this whole thing of spending $40 to $41 billion is really a shiny object to get us off the path.
It's actually closer, I think, to 35. 35, 30, you're saying fiscal year 2015 was the last, fiscal year 2015 was the last time the state of Illinois had a balanced budget.
And it wasn't balanced, if you remember, because Quinn left a budget that was not balanced, so they had to balance it at the very end.
Rauner worked with Madigan to do that. They actually worked together. So 35, 36 billion was okay then people would say, but there's been inflation, there's been changes in the last 2 years. Can you really go back to 36? You want to take, let's take 2 steps. You're saying you can go back to 36, which was what we had 2 years ago, and then you want to take it further to 32. But haven't there been changes? And people say, can you get by 2 years later, 2017, fiscal 2018, in the same thing we had 2 years before?
So I think the question that has to be asked is, why is government spending growing so fast? Where is all the money going? And we have to then ask a separate question. We had a massive tax hike in 2011 that brought in $32 billion new tax dollars out of people's wallets.
Over a 4-year period.
From 2011 to through 2014.
4 years, 32
4
billion.
years. And we ended up with the exact same problems that we had in Illinois, but they were worse after those 4 years of tax hikes. Where did the money go? And those are the questions that the taxpayers are asking. People shouldn't be forced to pay more and more until we reform how we spend.
Did it go mostly to pension payments, which run about $7 billion
That's right. About
a year?
90% of that tax hike money went to pensions.
Okay.
Pensions were unreformed. We didn't pay down the bills. Our economy got worse. We were downgraded 5 times while we had all those extra revenues by the rating agencies. Things went south despite the economy recovering nationally and despite all that money in Springfield's coffers.
But we did, when Rauner came in, the unpaid bills, which are now 14 billion, was probably down to 2 or 3 billion?
No, that's incorrect. So,
what were they when he came in?
Before the tax hike,
2 years ago?
Before the tax hike, they were around 8-something. After the tax hike, they were 6-something. So you had a couple $1 billion in reduction. That's after taking in $32 billion.
Well, we were running balanced budgets essentially during those years. Is that right?
No, we haven't had a balanced budget
since
2001.
We weren't running deficits of $7 to $8 billion. To be fair, 2011 to 2015, were we?
No, we weren't running as big a deficits. No.
Much smaller.
Much smaller, yes.
Okay.
But they were deficits.
Okay. So what would you do? You're king now. You can do anything to get the spending down to $32 billion from the current 40. Lay it out.
All right, so the first thing you got to do is set the narrative that we don't need tax hikes to fix our problems. And you're going to put the taxpayer first, and you're going to say, first thing we're going to do is ensure that all overspending, all waste, all bloat, all duplication, all those things have to go before you ever talk about tax hikes.
Okay, let's get to the big things.
Sure.
There's no line item, as they say,
Right.
for bloat, to cut bloat. So you folks want a property tax freeze. The governor wants.
Well, let's start with
freeze.
number one.
What is number one?
We've got to stop creating more and more pension debt.
Okay.
Every year, that's consuming more
So
and more
true
taxpayer.
pension reform. right?
So, right, and the only reform that we can do right now that's constitutional is to move all new workers to 401ks and give existing workers the option to go into a 401k. That's the most we can do constitutionally. We can also offer some buyouts and things like that.
All those self-managed plans?
Self-managed plans.
401k style?
Correct.
That is completely constitutional. There's no question about that.
No question about that. And what it does is you stop accruing these pensions that we cannot control and which have been politicized forever.
So all new employees go into these SMP self-managed plans?
Correct.
But does that now, people say, and the current employees can opt in if they want, right?
Correct.
Does that do enough soon enough to allow you to cut, to help cut the $8 billion from spending?
So it doesn't change the amount of debt we have to the pension funds. It doesn't touch that. Okay.
Come back to that later.
We'll come back to that later because
Let's talk about
that is a
deficit as opposed stocks and flows. We're talking about a flow. We're talking about getting the deficit down. We'll talk about the 130 or 200 billion
Correct.
in liabilities
That's
later.
a debt that we have to pay. But right now, I think what politicians owe the taxpayers is to stop the pension crisis from continuing to get worse and worse every year. And that's what we have now. I think it's an insult, frankly, to the taxpayers.
Okay. So
to ask them to pay billions, but hang on, Jeff, but to ask them to pay billions more when they haven't made the one key reform that stops pensions from growing. So that's number one.
Okay. So now, under this current plan, the state has to put in a payment of $7 to $8 billion, right?
Mhm.
That's a lot of money. That's almost a quarter of the budget.
And it continues to grow every year.
But you've got a way to reduce that money by how much? I mean, how do we get, what will be the amount going into pensions when you have a self-managed plan? What will be the savings from doing that as opposed to doing it the way we're doing now?
There's some immediate savings that can be had from some reforms that are in the plan and how we pay that debt over time. But of course, we don't change the debt that's owed. But
I'm talking about that flow. Right now, it's a big deal to make a payment of, say, $7 billion.
Correct.
Can we chip away at that? Can you tell me, can we decrease that payment by $1.5 billion or so?
So in the short term,
I think your document says that.
In the short term, we can get about $1.6 billion. Part of that is from changing some of the way that assumptions impact the payments that the state has to make, right? And so right now, the pension funds can change the assumptions and force the government to pay much more into the pension funds. We need to change how that works.
And that will allow you to create a new contribution schedule.
Correct. And
that saves you how much?
We can save about $1.6 billion in 2018.
Okay. So there are two things. You're changing the contribution schedule. You're also phasing in the costs of the pension fund, making these actuarial changes over a 5-year period. Altogether, you're saving $1.6 billion. Okay.
Now
so that's 1.6 of the $7 billion to $8 billion you're going to save.
Correct.
Okay.
And there's another billion in pensions, another 1.4 billion in pensions, where you shift the costs of pensions. Right now, the state is making 1.4 billion in pension payments on behalf of school districts. Teachers are not employees of the state; they are employees of individual school districts. And the state is making the pension payments on behalf of universities for their pension payments.
So that'll save you what, 1.4
billion. And it's not just a savings. Now, it does shift the cost to the school districts and to the universities. But I'll tell you why that has to happen. One, not only is it not a cost to the state, but it will change how pensions are doled out, how salaries are doled out, and benefits are doled out at the local government levels.
The local governments are paying the village of Winnetka, the village of Wilmette, Chicago, which claims it currently pays its pension. That's another matter. But all of these villages, cities around the state, the school districts, are going to have to pick up these costs. And since they're going to pick up the costs in the olden days, and currently, they try to spike things. They try to say, here's your last few years. We don't pay the pensions, so we'll jack up your salary. People try to limit that in this legislature. They don't seem able to. We'll jack up your salary. You'll get higher pensions. But, folks, it's okay because we're not paying it. The state is.
That's right. School districts are hiking salaries. They're handing out pension benefits.
But now, under your plan, they would have to pay it. So your point is they'll be more frugal because they're taxpayers in Wilmette, in Bartlett, in Hoffman Estates, in Rockford, all these places we are. all of those areas, these people are going to say, hey, let's be careful with this because this money's coming from us.
They're going to be more prudent because it's going to take local tax dollars to pay for it. And when they're responsible for whatever they dole out, okay, so that's a big part of the incentive structure to change how much pensions are being doled out.
That's part of the free market, liberty-oriented approach of you guys.
Well,
not the Illinois policy.
Yeah, and I wouldn't call it free market, liberty-oriented. What I'd call it is putting accountability where it belongs.
Well,
because,
it is free
because
market.
Jeff,
Go ahead.
no, Jeff, because if a school district wants to dole out super high salaries, which means super high pensions, they should bear that cost. And right now, school districts are doling out those benefits and high salaries, but asking the state taxpayers to pay for it. And that's where there's a disconnect between a unit of government that doles out the benefits and then who pays for it.
Well, I would say free market in the sense, you know, you folks are not anarchists. You understand there has to be a certain amount of government, but you'd like to minimize the role of government. And when you have government, even Milton Friedman, Capitalism and Freedom, Milton was not an anarchist. He understood there are certain things that have to be provided by government, but you try to mimic the marketplace and set incentives. So this is giving government, as they run the schools, or at least the financing of the schools, whether they should run it is another matter, they have the right incentives. To me, that's a free market approach, because in a free market, you constantly have people balancing benefits and costs. In the government, you don't unless you set up those incentives. Is that you agree?
Yeah, and you can also create incentives to game the system, which is
The
effectively
wrong kinds of incentives.
Which is effectively what we have today.
Okay, so we
so
saved
that's very important for the pension reform.
On the pension so far, you've saved $3 billion of the $8 billion you've got to save. Where do we go next?
Okay, after that, you look at property taxes. Now, interestingly enough, property taxes are not part of the state budget.
Right.
But we like to talk about, you know, setting this up as comprehensive local property tax reform. The big issue there is that the state mandates many costs at the local level that push up the cost of property taxes. Not only that, they subsidize tremendous amounts of money that go to local governments. And so when you subsidize and mandate local governments to do more and more, the local governments get bigger and bigger, and they cost more and more. So a way to unwind all that, and again, let me remind everybody here that Illinois has the highest property taxes in the nation. So it's this combination of the state and local industrial complex, if you will, that's pushing up Illinois' property taxes to be the highest in the nation. So how do you fix that?
Before you
start to unwind it.
Okay, but just so I don't forget, we'll come to the unwinding. But why is that important? Why are property taxes being high relative to other states important? Why are taxes being high in Illinois relative to other states important? I mean, tell me, why is that important? Well, maybe it's obvious, but...
Well, I think it's pretty obvious when you have a legislature that's talking about a $5 to $7 to $9 billion tax hike. When Illinois already paid the highest property taxes in the nation, you're wondering...
Who does it hurt? How does it hurt the state of Illinois to have higher taxes than Wisconsin and other states?
Well, I think in the end, you're talking about, this is people's livelihoods. For people to live here, they've got to be able to pay their bills, to save money, fund their children's education, have a job, and so higher property taxes.
So aside from the more money's coming out of their pocket, where do they get any of their money? Most people.
So they get it from jobs.
Jobs.
And so higher property taxes. I'm about to get there. So
yeah.
Higher property taxes mean, right, that employers have a hard time locating in Illinois, or either staying in Illinois or coming into Illinois.
We're losing population. We're losing companies.
People are being squeezed out of their homes, and all of that creates a negative environment where you have a declining tax base.
So if you want to freeze property taxes, is that right?
Correct.
The governor wants to freeze property taxes.
I think most people are in alignment with. Actually, I shouldn't say most, but there's a big move for everybody in Illinois who pays property taxes.
So won't the Democrats say, we'll give you 2 years, freeze it for 2 years, and then we'll see how it's working? What's wrong with that? Because, you know, it's a radical change to have this freeze. Maybe it's not going to work so well. Isn't that reasonable to try for 2 years?
It's not reasonable. We know that in 2 years, the cost will continue to bubble underground, right? Contracts are still going. People can, school districts, governments they can borrow. They can continue to borrow. Right. They can continue to accrue debt, accrue cost.
So what
and
happens
then when the 2 year freeze
years?
Finishes, we're back to normal.
So when you say, do you want a permanent tax freeze, a 4 year? The governor's talking about a 4-year tax freeze. When he was thinking about going along with the tax increase, he said, okay, you want this tax increase, you want it for 4 years? Give me a 4-year property tax freeze. You guys okay with that?
No, right now I think we shouldn't be mixing those two things together. I think
which are the two things?
Which is saying that we would accept a tax hike if we had a property tax freeze. got to remember, we're talking about a property tax freeze at the highest level in the U.S. So it is no gift to Illinoisans.
Because it's a freeze, it's not a cut.
It's a freeze, right? And you're freezing at the highest level in the nation. So that is not a gift to anybody. So people who are demanding lower cost of government, people who are looking to find more job opportunities, who want to see a more vibrant Illinois, don't need a tax freeze. They need tax relief. Companies that are paying some of the highest property taxes in the nation, they need tax relief. Companies that might move to Illinois want to see a place where top property taxes are going down, not up.
So if you freeze property taxes, which in a sense prevents them from getting higher, that is a savings relative to what it would be if you didn't freeze them, but then you go ahead and you turn around and give a $5.4 billion increase in income tax, you're saying that's no good deal because you're raising it on one side, you're keeping it level on the other side, you're saying, no income tax increase.
That's not the kind of reforms Illinois
You're saying no income tax increase and a property tax freeze. Am I getting that right?
Correct.
Okay. So if you do that property tax freeze, how much do you save overall?
All right, so now let's be real clear about that.
How does the state save money from that?
All right, so let's be real clear about that. A property tax freeze by itself, high property tax rates, that's not the problem. That's a symptom of the problem. The real problem is how much our local governments spend. We have the most units of local government in the nation, and they are all staffed by heavy, expensive bureaucracies.
Okay. So it's a spending by local governments, and the state gets involved because the state subsidizes some of that spending. So you would cut the subsidy of the state to the local government. If the local governments are not getting that subsidy, they're going to spend less. Again,
that's correct.
They'll spend somebody else's money. It's all the Illinois taxpayers' money, but the local government officials look at it, somebody else is paying for it, right?
Well, this is the problem right now, is the local governments get to spend all this state money, but they're not responsible for raising it. So they get a free lunch on that one. What we want to do is make local governments defend their spending.
So how much do you save when you embark on this property tax for the state?
Right, so we save another $2 billion for the state when we embark on that.
$2 billion because you eliminate the local government distributive fund.
Let's call it
$1.75 billion or so that goes from the state to these local governments.
Correct. So we eliminate some of these subsidies.
And
remember,
you can get even more.
Very, very important point, Jeff, is for that to happen, we don't want the local people to be hurt by this. So what we want to do is also pair our reforms with giving local governments the power to negotiate better contracts, because right now state laws force the government to pay really high rates for a lot of things. And so by empowering local governments to have more power over the contracts they negotiate, that will lower the cost of government.
So you want to empower the local governments to lower their costs. And what is there's several things that are key ways to do it.
So one of those is right now the government is forced to negotiate certain things. A lot of things in contracts with the unions. We need to reduce the number of items that are collectively bargained, and that means the mayor isn't forced to pay up all these extra costs.
Does the state need to give the power to the local governments to curtail the scope of collective bargaining?
That's correct.
So they have to pass that legislation. Right now,
exactly.
If Wilmette, if Hoffman Estates, if Bartlett, if, Springfield, if they want to do these things, they can't.
They can't, right? They're forced by law.
They need the state law to empower them to cut their costs. If they can cut their costs, then they're fine with the property tax freeze because they can live on less because they're spending less.
Correct.
Is that sort of the theory?
Right, and you've got a lot of...
Is the governor, I know that you're not in politics, but in a sense you are because you're in a political world. So is the governor, I've heard him talk about the property tax freeze, is he talking about this curtailment of the scope of collective bargaining and going to Speaker Madigan and going to Senate President Cullerton and say, look, we need you guys to authorize this change in the law? Because I haven't heard him do that.
No, so we're looking, we want to make sure that whatever deals are done include a comprehensive property tax reform. You can't just freeze taxes. It doesn't solve the problem. You've got to do the things that we talked about.
Have you said this to the governor?
We've laid that out in our plans. We've said it to lots of people.
But you guys talk. John Tillman's the CEO here, and he probably talks. He's to the governor. Other people talk to the governor.
Well, I'm sure the governor and his team know what's in our plan.
They know, okay.
They know what's in our plan, and they know the kind of things that we're
Do you think he's in sync with you folks?
You'll have to ask the governor that directly. I can't tell you that. But what I can tell you is that you can't just pass a short-term property tax freeze. That will not solve the problem. In fact,
you have to do these other things you're talking about.
Okay.
because we're going to run out of time. If you do these other things, you save about $3.4 billion in total. We had $3 billion saved, I think, on pensions.
Well,
so we got another billion.
One and a half. You're double counting because I moved 1.5
okay.
to pensions. But
so how much do we have so far?
So you're talking about 1.6 and 3.5. You're talking about $5 billion right now.
Okay. So where do we get the other 2 to 3 billion?
So the rest can come from Medicaid reforms and reforms like the cost of state government and the cost of higher ed.
Well, let's go to higher ed first.
Sure.
Only because that's very important. People are talking about, well, they're all very important, but mostly a lot in the news about higher ed in Illinois being pinched. They've not received money in the same way education has over these 2 years of no budgets. Now they say they're getting pinched more. They're saying people are applying not to the University of Illinois but to other institutions out of state because they're not sure if there will be funding. You've heard all of these things happening.
Absolutely.
Your solution is?
So I think, first of all, we've got to get the narrative right. Illinois universities and community colleges have made a mess of their own making for the last decade and more. Tuitions have jumped 100% in the last decade. The staffing surge has been incredible at the universities. While the student growth has been relatively small, the staffing and the administrative growth, not teachers, not professors, but the administrators has grown tremendously.
Why is that? Why is that?
We'll have to ask the
colleges. That's another show.
But if you look at the executive pay that they get, the number of six-figure salaries that go with those executive staffs and these administrative staffs, it is tremendous how much money has been taken to go there at the expense of either keeping tuitions down or funding MAP grants.
So you've got to get universities in Illinois, colleges in Illinois, to spend less on administrators. And if you can do that, you can save money without hurting students, without raising tuition, without taking teaching resources away.
Right. The universities have become job programs, and they pay executive level pay for those jobs. So we got to unwind that. And that
How do you do that?
Now let me explain one thing.
We only got 2 or 3 minutes
Illinois
left.
appropriates much more to higher ed than our neighboring states. We spend a lot of money. So the point is not how much money we spend, but where it goes. And right now it's going to the fat. You got to cut it. You've got to cut those.
So
those
what do you
administrative
do
positions.
because there's no line item that says fat? What is your recommendation to save money that's going right now to higher ed but is being wasted on administrators?
I think what we're seeing right now, the struggle of the last 2 years without the budget has forced most of those universities to go and look at their administrative staffs and their ineffective programs or programs that are just not efficient, and they're scaling them back.
You basically want to go to them and say, cut your spending by 10%. We're advising you, you control it, the boards do of these universities, but we're advising you to cut not teachers, but administrators, cut, say, $500 million, because you're getting $500 million less.
Prioritize students over the jobs.
Okay, we only got a minute or 2 left. We're almost up to the $8 billion. AFSCME, that's the other source?
AFSCME, AFSCME, has the highest.
What is AFSCME? Explain to people.
That's the largest public sector union in the state. It has about 50,000.
Unionize a lot of the state employees. You're saying those salaries, those benefits are too high?
Yeah, so Illinois state employees
we
have
can't
the highest.
have time to go through all of it, but
they have the highest salaries in the nation. They have a lot of great benefits. It's too expensive for the people that pay them.
Make these folks more like private sector employees, and you'll save how much?
We'll get another $500 million there.
Okay. So if we've added this up quickly, we're about savings of $7 or $8 billion. Right?
And there's more. Medicaid reforms, more dramatic.
Right. Okay.
Structural reforms can give you more.
And we haven't even touched reform like school choice, school vouchers, charter schools, where you could actually provide better services
at
a
lower cost.
We didn't even do that.
No. There's more to go. There's more to go.
No, but
and we'll be a better
politically,
state.
how do you accomplish this? How do you accomplish it in 1 minute? You got the governor, you got J.B. Pritzker, you got the running in the Democratic primary, Chris Kennedy, Daniel Biss.
Jeff, let me interrupt you. The way you do it is you listen
got
to the
4
people.
Democrats
you
saying
listen to the
they
people.
disagree with you. They disagree. You understand? All those people say the solution is a progressive income tax in 2018. Cut the tax on 92% of the people, and you'll be fine. The rich will pay for it. And what's wrong with that?
We just did a poll. Illinois do not want tax hikes. People are leaving in record numbers from Illinois. Right? Only New York competes with us for losing people. We can't continue down that same path. Otherwise, we'll lose our tax base. We'll lose our.
You think you got the
job
people
base.
on your side?
The people on our side, and that's who matters. Not Pritzker, not Rauner, not
Ted Dabrowski.
The people are the ones who matter in this.
I'll tell you a little bit about Ted, undergraduate degree, Georgia Tech, Wharton Business School, master's in public policy from Harris at the University of Chicago, experience in the private sector, Citibank, 6 years at the Illinois Policy Institute. He didn't just wake up and say, here's an idea. You've been doing this like 5 or 6 years.
No, we've been working on it.
Are you going to make a prediction now? When they see this show, first, second week in June, will there be an increase in tax increase? Will there be a tax increase that passed or no?
No.
Okay, you heard it here first on Public Affairs. Look, thank you so much. We almost got done. We can have a little bit more. Come back, you promised.
Anytime.